North Carolina, September 27, 2019. Weather: violent storm, relentless thunder. I was only 13 years old, but that night, something inside me knew my life would change forever. My parents had begun to trust me to stay home alone, a responsibility I carried with a mix of pride and nervousness. For a kid my age, being left alone for a few hours felt like the pinnacle of independence, as if the world had suddenly opened up in front of me, full of possibilities. But that night, that stormy night, was the last time I felt that freedom as something good. The sky was covered with thick, threatening black clouds, as if the world was about to collapse on me. Lightning tore through the horizon so violently it seemed like nature itself was screaming in agony. The sound of the rain falling on the roof, incessant, became almost a hypnotic melody, a symphony of chaos outside that, strangely, brought me peace inside. My parents' house, though large and full of dark corners that could hide all kinds of shadows, was my fortress. I was alone, yes, but I felt protected by the walls that surrounded us. There, that night, I felt invulnerable, and that, I realize now, was my biggest mistake. After spending some time watching the storm under the awning, breathing in the humid air and feeling the adrenaline that only a night like that could offer, I decided to take my Xbox to the living room. My dad's TV, a huge screen that dominated the room, was practically an altar in our house. No one, except him, was allowed to touch it. But that night, with them gone, the throne was mine. The sound of the game filled the room, and I was immersed in Black Ops battles. Nothing else existed but the explosions and gunfire on the virtual battlefield, the outside world dissolving into the background. I was playing online with my friend Cody, laughing and shouting into the headset, ignoring the noise of the rain outside. By then, the storm was furious, thunder shaking the windows and lightning briefly illuminating the rooms of the house. Time seemed to move differently when I was playing, as if hours slipped by in minutes. I was completely absorbed until something unexpected and disturbing happened. The doorbell rang. The moment the doorbell echoed through the house, my heart skipped a beat. It was a strange sound, out of place in the middle of that thunderous chaos. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 9:30 p.m. Who could be ringing the bell at this hour and in such a storm? Immediately, my instinct told me something was wrong. It wasn't the kind of time for unexpected visitors. My parents wouldn't be back early, and if they did return, they'd certainly use their keys to enter. The doorbell didn't make sense. I told Cody that someone was at the door, and he responded casually, as if he saw no danger. "Go on, see who it is." But of course, he wasn't here. He wasn't in the middle of the storm, alone, in an empty house. He wasn't feeling the stomach-turning uncertainty like I was. I slowly got up from the couch, trying to calm the avalanche of thoughts forming in my mind. Maybe it's just a mistake, I thought. Maybe someone was looking for another house. Or maybe it was a neighbor in need of help. The storm, after all, was ugly outside. Nothing serious, I kept repeating to myself as I walked down the hallway toward the front door. But each step I took seemed to echo through the corridor, an empty, hollow sound that heightened the tension. When I finally reached the door, I felt a chill run down my spine, and I realized I was hesitating. I asked who was there, my voice coming out quieter than usual, almost drowned out by the sound of the storm. For a moment, the silence on the other side was deafening, until a rough, slightly trembling male voice responded, "I just need to use the phone. I got stuck in the rain." There was something wrong with that voice. It had an urgency, yes, but it was a forced urgency, almost as if he were playing a role. A bad feeling settled in my chest. I didn't respond. I just went back to the living room, trying to make as little noise as possible, praying he'd think I wasn't home. When I sat back down on the couch, trying to refocus on the game, I told Cody what had happened. He responded jokingly, saying something like, "Yo, what the hell? Don't open it, man." His attempt at humor didn't calm me. I could no longer concentrate on the game. My mind was fixated on the idea that someone was out there, in the dark, watching me. Even with the sound of war in the game, all I could hear was the rain hammering the house and the distant echo of the doorbell that still resonated in my ears. Then the doorbell rang again. This time the sound was louder, more insistent, as if the person outside was losing patience. My heart raced. I stood up again, slower this time, as if I were walking on eggshells. "Ignore it," Cody said through the headset, but it was too late. I was already fully drawn into that scenario, and there was no way to just pretend nothing was happening. For a few minutes, the doorbell stopped ringing. The relief I felt was almost instant, as if something inside me was telling me the danger had passed. My muscles relaxed, and I returned to the game, trying to convince myself everything was fine. But then, something happened that turned that small discomfort into absolute terror. I heard the sound of a door closing, not just any door. It was the glass door at the back, the one that led to the backyard. I slowly turned my head, as if my body was fighting against the idea of facing whatever was about to happen. And then, there he was, a tall man, his silhouette distorted by the darkness and the lightning, was inside my house. I saw him cross the threshold of the door, his movements slow and calculated, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. For a moment, I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was as if my brain was trying to process what was happening, but something inside me simply refused to accept reality. When I finally managed to move, I dropped the Xbox controller and ran to the office. I slammed the door with all the strength I could muster and locked it, my trembling hands making the movement difficult. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Then, the doorknob began to shake violently. The man was trying to get in. "Kid, open the door. I just want to use the phone." His voice, once hurried, was now filled with anger. He banged on the door so hard I could feel the vibrations through the wooden floor. "Open up, you little shit!" His words became more violent, more desperate, and with each bang, I was sure the door would give way. I knew I didn't have much time. The office had another door, one that led to the garage. It was my only chance. I took a deep breath, trying to keep control of my trembling body. I pressed the button to open the garage door, hoping the sound of the motor wasn't too loud to give me away. The metallic noise was deafening, echoing in the empty garage, but I had no choice. As soon as the door was high enough, I crawled under it and ran, as fast as I could, toward my neighbor Julian's house. Each step in the mud, The cold rain hitting my face was a struggle against the fear that consumed every cell in my body. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel the presence of that man, the shadow of danger following me. When I finally reached Julian's door, I knocked hard, nearly collapsing on the steps of the porch. I heard his dog, Copper, barking loudly, as if it knew something terrible was happening. Julian opened the door, his eyes wide with surprise at seeing me there, completely soaked and terrified. I could barely speak, the words tumbling out as I tried to explain what had happened. "There's a man. He broke in. He's inside the house." The sentences came out in gasps between breaths and panic. He grabbed me by the shoulders, pulling me inside as his wife, Lydia, appeared in the hallway, just as confused as he was. "Call the police," I begged. Julian didn't hesitate. He grabbed the phone and called 911, his voice low and urgent as he explained the situation. That was the longest moment of my life. Time seemed to freeze as we waited for the police to arrive, each second dragging on like an eternity. The sound of the storm outside continued, but now it was a backdrop to the absolute fear consuming my thoughts. When the flashing lights of the police cars finally illuminated the street, I felt a wave of relief. We went out to talk to them, and after explaining everything that had happened, the officers went into my house. I waited, frozen with fear and anxiety, outside. And then, after what seemed like a lifetime, they came out, handcuffing the man who had broken into my home. His name was John McCarty, a complete stranger, someone who should never have crossed my path. But that night, he did, and he changed my life forever. He screamed as he was taken away, his words incoherent, as if he were out of his mind. "This is my house. That's my son." He repeated it several times, his voice hoarse and filled with a madness that chilled me to the bone. Even though he was arrested, the idea that one day he might come back haunted me. From that moment on, my sense of safety, the belief that my home was an inviolable place, disappeared. My parents were devastated when they learned what had happened. They decided to press charges, and McCarty was charged with burglary and assault. However, even with him in jail, the shadow of what had happened hung over me. I couldn't sleep well for weeks, and whenever the wind rattled the windows or I heard footsteps in the hallway, my heart would race, as if he had returned. Eventually, we moved houses, and although my parents stayed there for a while longer, that house was never the same for me. It had become the stage for a nightmare, and every time I thought about that stormy night, I relived every second, every knock on the door, every moment of pure terror. I still watch horror story videos online, but they don't have the same impact as before. Now, after what I've lived through, true terror is etched in me in a way that no fictional story will ever surpass. After that incident, life took on a different rhythm, as if the clock in my personal world had adjusted to a slower, quieter pace, full of invisible tension. That feeling of freedom and independence I had cherished, especially in the rare moments when my parents left me home alone, was replaced by constant unease. I could no longer enjoy solitude with the same enthusiasm, and every creak, every unusual sound, brought back memories of that hellish night. The days that followed the break-in were an endless sequence of uncomfortable conversations with my parents, neighbors, and occasionally the police. My parents alternated between trying to comfort me assuring me something like this would never happen again, and speaking with lawyers to figure out what could be done to ensure McCarty wouldn't return to haunt us. I knew, however, that they were just as scared as I was. It wasn't just the invasion itself, but the realization that in a seemingly safe and ordinary world, chaos could seep through any crack. The bad dreams started a few nights after the incident, dreams that, as I lay in bed and closed my eyes, felt as real as the moments I had lived through during that storm. Sometimes, it was the same scene repeated, me playing in the living room, the doorbell ringing, and when I turned to look at the back door, John McCarty was there, standing still, watching me with that empty, unsettling stare. Other times, the dream was more surreal, but just as terrifying. Faceless shadows walking through my house, each one closer than the last, all trying to reach the door I was desperately trying to keep shut. I would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating and with my heart racing, unable to fall back asleep for hours. It was then that my parents decided to install security cameras around the house. Apparently, this was supposed to make me feel safer, but it had the opposite effect. Every time I looked at those small lenses blinking red, I could only think that we were being watched, that someone, somewhere, was waiting for the right moment to try to break in again. The irony is that the presence of the cameras made me feel even more vulnerable, as if the very act of monitoring our home signaled that there was something to fear. We stayed in the house for another 6 months. During that time, we did everything we could to try to move on. My parents believed that time would heal all wounds, that normalcy would return, and that eventually I'd forget what had happened. They were wrong. Every new evening, as the daylight faded and night began to envelop the house, the dread I had felt on that stormy night returned in full force. Even though I was surrounded by my parents, I felt as if the walls were always on the verge of collapsing, as if at any moment John McCarty or another intruder could enter through the back door again. The case against McCarty moved forward slowly. He was diagnosed with mental health issues, something that didn't surprise me at all. The defense attorney argued that he wasn't responsible for his actions, that the night of the break-in was an isolated incident brought on by a severe mental health crisis, worsened by alcohol and drug use. These details trickled down to me in fragments, pieces of conversations I overheard from my parents and other adults around me. But I understood enough to know that, to the system, he was a victim of his own circumstances. The fact that he would be released sooner or later was almost inevitable, and that's exactly what happened. A few months after his arrest, McCarty was transferred to a psychiatric institution, and although there were assurances he'd receive treatment and be kept away from our town, the fear that he might somehow return continued to haunt my thoughts. My parents were divided. My father wanted us to move, to distance ourselves from any possibility of a new encounter with that man, while my mother insisted we were safe, that what had happened was an isolated incident, and that we shouldn't let fear control our lives. I knew my father was right. The house would never be the same, at least not for me. Every room, every hallway, every window now carried an echo of what had happened that night. It was as if the walls had absorbed the fear I had felt, and instead of protecting me, they seemed to want to remind me of every detail of the invasion, like a living memory. When we finally moved, I felt a wave of relief but also a strange sadness. It wasn't that I liked that house, far from it. It had become a symbol of my trauma. But moving meant closing a chapter that in some way I still hadn't fully processed. I knew that leaving the house behind didn't mean leaving its ghosts behind, and even in the new home, the feeling of insecurity followed me. No matter how locked the doors were, even with the new alarms and locks, part of me knew the real threat wasn't outside. Months after we moved, things started to feel relatively normal again. The new house was smaller and less isolated, which gave me a comforting sense of security. The constant noise of the neighborhood, with kids playing, cars passing, and people walking by, made the fears of solitude fade away a bit. There was life around me, and that was good. But whenever a new storm formed on the horizon, I felt the old fear resurface like a dark tide, pulling me back to that night. During one of those storms, I was home alone again. My parents had gone to dinner at a friend's house, and I, now 14 years old, tried to convince myself that this was a good opportunity to face my fears. This time, I wouldn't hide. This time, I would face the night and whatever it brought, even if it was just the silence interrupted by rain and wind. I turned on the TV to try to drown out the sound of the storm, putting on some action movie to keep my mind occupied, but inevitably, I ended up looking out the window. The sky was once again filled with black clouds, and the rain poured heavily on the roof, almost perfectly replicating the scene from that night that still haunted me. I sat on the couch trying to focus on the movie, but soon realized I was doing the same thing as always, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the doorbell to ring, waiting for the back door to open on its own. I was my own worst enemy, reliving the past and turning it into an endless cycle of dread. When the doorbell rang, I almost jumped off the couch. The sound was loud, insistent, and echoed through the house exactly as before. My heart raced. I stood there, frozen for a few seconds, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me. It couldn't be. No one would ring the doorbell in the middle of a storm like this. Not again. But the doorbell rang a second time, and this time, the voice inside my head screamed at me not to repeat the mistake of before. I walked to the door with slow steps, feeling the panic rise in my throat. My body was in a state of high alert, as if every cell was ready to either run or fight. I looked through the peephole, and what I saw made me feel as if all the air had been sucked out of my body. There was no one there. My eyes stayed fixed on the peephole for a few seconds, which felt like hours. Outside, the storm raged furiously. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and the raindrops, which had once sounded like distant drumming, were now pounded violently against the door, as if the sky itself was trying to break into the house. But there was no one, no dark figure waiting, no silhouette of a stranger lurking. I should have felt relieved. I knew that. But instead of calming my racing heart, the emptiness outside only deepened my fear. It was as if the absence of a visible threat was, in itself, a warning. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or some electrical fault. Maybe the storm had caused a short circuit in the doorbell system. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, my instincts said otherwise. Something was wrong. I went back to the couch, trying to focus again on the movie, but my mind kept wandering back to the door. My body was tense, like a taut wire ready to snap. Every little sound, a branch dragged by the wind, water running down the eaves, made my heart jump. The movie, with its explosions and action scenes, became just background noise, a distant hum that barely masked the sound of the storm outside. Suddenly, I heard a different sound. It wasn't the doorbell this time. It was a lower noise, a soft but persistent scratching coming from the back door. A cold chill ran down my spine. The sound was all too familiar, much like the one from the night McCarty had tried to break in through the same door. I stood up, my muscles stiff with tension, and slowly made my way to the kitchen, where the glass door leading to the backyard was. With each step I took, the scratching grew clearer. There was no doubt. Someone was out there. My heart pounded in my chest, the blood rushing too fast through my veins. I stood in the entrance to the kitchen for a moment, watching the glass door. The rain pounded hard against it, making it difficult to see what was outside, but I knew something or someone was there. The survival instinct screamed inside me to run, to lock all the doors, to call the police, but I didn't move. Part of me wanted to know. Part of me needed to see with my own eyes what was trying to get in. With trembling hands, I approached the door and quickly pulled the curtain aside. And then, there it was. A hooded figure, indistinct in the dim light of the storm, was standing with its back to me, just a few feet from the door. The scratching stopped the moment I pulled the curtain, as if it knew it was being watched. My heart was beating so fast I could feel the pulse in my throat. The figure remained still for a few seconds. Then, slowly, it turned its head in my direction. I instinctively recoiled. The figure's face was obscured by the shadow of the hood, but I could see a glint in its eyes. It wasn't the kind of glint you'd expect from a normal person. It was something almost supernatural, a sinister light that shouldn't have been there. Before I could react, the figure took a step forward, then another, as if preparing to advance. My legs were frozen to the ground, my body unable to respond to the urgency of the imminent danger. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the figure stopped. It stood there, motionless, as if studying me. For a moment, I thought about running, but when my eyes locked on the figure again, something changed. It slowly backed away, dissolving into the darkness of the storm. There was no sound, no footprints left in the muddy ground. It was as if it had never been there. For a moment, I stood still, trying to process what had just happened. My whole body was trembling, a mixture of shock and adrenaline flooding through me. I knew I needed to lock the door, but my muscles seemed paralyzed. The fear was so palpable it was hard to even breathe. Finally, I managed to move. I locked the door with shaking hands and ran for the phone. I needed to call my parents, call someone, but there was no signal. The storm had cut the connection. I was alone. I sat on the kitchen floor, trying to organize my thoughts, trying to find some logic in what had just happened. But there was no logic. Everything seemed unreal, as if I were living a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. The doorbell ringing on its own, the hooded stranger in the backyard. None of it made sense, and the question that haunted me the most was, why was this happening again? That stormy night, months ago, I had escaped John McCarty, a disturbed man who had broken into my house. But now, who or what was lurking in the darkness this time? McCarty was either in jail or treatment. He couldn't be responsible. So why did it feel like the darkness had followed me, even to the new house? Was it the same man, or something worse? Maybe it was just fear playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whatever had been out there was real, and I knew it wasn't over yet. When the storm finally began to die down, it was nearly midnight. The silence that followed the sound of the rain was almost as disturbing as the storm itself. Sitting on the kitchen floor, knees pressed against my chest, and the useless phone in my hand, I felt the weight of exhaustion take over me. The tension and terror of the past hours had drained all my energy. I wanted to sleep, wanted to forget everything that had happened, but I knew that was impossible. My body and mind were on high alert, ready to react to any strange sound or movement. That's when I heard a noise. It wasn't a loud sound, but enough to pull me out of the daze I had been in. Something was moving upstairs. At first, I thought it might be the wind or some noise from the house settling, but the sound was rhythmic, steady. Footsteps. Someone was walking upstairs. I slowly stood up, feeling my heart race once again. I was alone in the house. I knew that, but the footsteps continued, slow and heavy, as if someone was deliberately walking down the hallway. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen drawer. It wasn't much, but it gave me a minimal sense of protection, and began to climb the stairs, each step making the floorboards creak under my feet. I reached the top of the stairs. The hallway in front of me plunged in semi-darkness. The only sound was my own breathing, fast and irregular. I looked toward the end of the hallway, where my parents' bedroom was. The door was ajar, and the darkness inside seemed denser, more oppressive than usual. I took a step toward the bedroom, the sound of footsteps now ceasing. Everything was too quiet, like the calm before an even bigger storm. When I reached the door of my parents' room, I pushed it open slowly, holding the knife tightly. The room was empty. The bed, perfectly made, showed no signs that anyone had entered. But then, something caught my attention. The bedroom window, which my parents always kept closed, was slightly open, the curtains swaying gently with the cold night breeze. I stood still for a long moment, trying to decide what to do. Close the window or run back downstairs and leave the house. The paralyzing fear took over me again. I looked out the window. The darkness outside seemed to stare back at me, but I saw nothing. No hooded figure, no movement among the trees. Maybe I was becoming paranoid. Maybe the sound I heard was just the remnants of the storm and my mind playing tricks on me. I closed the window with trembling hands and went back downstairs to the living room. I sat there on the couch, waiting for dawn, every sound making me jump. When my parents returned, I couldn't explain what had happened, the fear still lodged in my throat. But one thing was clear: the past never dies. And whatever had entered my life on that first stormy night was still lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And I knew deep down that next time it could be worse.